The second round of the French national snap elections are now done, and for New Caledonia, one of the two seats is now held by a pro-independence candidate, signalling a potential setback for the pro-French camp. Meanwhile, in French Polynesia, the pro-independence party has lost in 2 of the 3 constituencies. Koroi Hawkins spoke with Patrick de Cloyter on our French Pacific desk about the results.
Thank you, Thomas Patrick, for storytelling me back more. So, what were the results of the French snap elections in the French Pacific territories?
Well, last week I was saying that the most likely scenario for New Caledonia would be one pro-France MP and the other pro-independence. And this is what happened. Some say it was a surprise. I still think this was likely to happen because more than ever, politics in New Caledonia is polarized block to block, especially after the last 2 months of riots and violence. I think voters took the opportunity of these national elections to vent their frustrations, their anger, their sadness, and vote a little bit as if it was some kind of a referendum on whether New Caledonia should remain French or be independent. And looking at the candidates from each side, well, they were likely to get full support from their respective supporters. In fact, the participation rate was as high as 71%. For the loyalists, pro-France, Nicolas Metzdorf managed to get re-elected and retain his seat. But on the pro-independence side, one candidate also scored really well, mainly because of his character and his history. He ended up winning the second seat in the French Parliament. This man is Emmanuel Tjibaou, the son of the late Jean-Marie Tjibaou. He was the man who 36 years ago signed the Matignon peace agreement with French PM, at the time socialist Michel Rocard, and pro-France leader at the time too, Jacques Lafleur. That agreement was mainly designed to end half a decade of a quasi-civil war in New Caledonia. So, 36 years later, his son is entering politics with big shoes to fill. His father, a moderate pro-independence leader of the FLNKS, was in fact murdered in 1989 by a radical member of the pro-independence movement. So this is also the first time in almost 40 years that the indigenous pro-independence Kanak movement is represented at the French National Assembly. So it's a very symbolic election for someone who has just entered politics at 47, being himself a moderate, even though he was contesting on behalf of the Union Calédonienne, which is the more radical component of the FLNKS. So in New Caledonia, we now have a pro-independence, but rather moderate new MP, Tjibaou, whose election is even welcomed by the pro-French group because they say he is a man at least they can talk to, not a radical, so there could be a glimmer of light and hope at the end of the tunnel. And by the way, this is what Tjibaou said on Sunday night during the post-election debrief on public TV, New Caledonia La Première.
This is
proof that democracy is still alive and kicking in this country. Then I'm also impressed by the situation in which our country is plunged today. These are not acceptable conditions. We see everything that's happening. We have to gain perspective, even if it's difficult. And then our country is also sinking into an economic crisis. So it's complicated to project ourselves with our feet tied to this weight dragging us underwater. This situation is dramatic. We must restore the conditions for dialogue. It's not acceptable to live in a country where our leaders said we could walk together. There is a kind of dichotomy, a widening gap. And yet, I think we must engage in the future, take responsibility, and then restore the country. It is our country. And this electoral campaign has shown us that we all still believe that what our fathers started when they signed 2 political agreements is still possible. So it's a cry for help. It's a cry for hope.
Now, not forgetting the other side of the Pacific in French Polynesia, as opposed to New Caledonia with a victory for the pro-independence parties, in French Polynesia, for the pro-independence Tavini Huira Tira, it's a setback. The Tavini has lost 2 of the 3 seats that he had won at the previous general elections 2 years ago, and that's because mainly the pro-France party, who were divided as an opposition force, finally decided to form an alliance to contest those national elections as a united platform. And it paid. So for French Polynesia, for the 3 national constituencies, there's only one left on the pro-independence movement, and the other 2 are now held by what people call there the pro-autonomy parties.
Now, to the results in France, quite a surprise, I understand. And what do those potentially mean for the Pacific territories?
Now, talking about a link with New Caledonia, depending on what the next government in France will look like once it's formed, it could be a possibility that the Socialist Party, a component of the new Popular Front, could take care of New Caledonia and try to resume political talks with local parties. Because, historically, the socialists have the experience, and it was under their watch that the 2 major political agreements with New Caledonia were signed, first with Michel Rocard in 1988, and 10 years later, in 1998, under another socialist PM, Lionel Jospin, for the Nouméa Accord. Now, there are very urgent matters to be dealt with regarding New Caledonia and very urgent financial needs to salvage the economy, which business owners say is now in a critical situation after all this destruction. But at the moment, with the government in caretaker mode, no important decision can be made until a new government emanating from the new majority emerges. And depending on the negotiations, no one really knows when New Caledonia's pressing issues will at last be addressed, not to mention, of course, the Olympic Games opening in Paris in about 2 weeks.
In terms of the government formation process, what happens now?
It's all about wait and see now at the national level. These snap elections have produced a National Assembly, which is now divided more or less into 3 blocks. To make it simple, left, right and centre. First, the incumbent PM, Gabriel Attal, has tendered his resignation on Monday to the French president, but Macron asked him to stay at least until a new prime minister is appointed. So we now have a caretaker prime minister. We have negotiations in full swing behind the scenes between those 3 blocks at the National Assembly, because no one can obviously pretend to form a government and govern on their own. The new government would obviously result from those negotiations still taking place. And a little bit of gossip on the rumour front on Monday, what was circulating behind the scenes as well in the French party's corridors, was that former socialist French president François Hollande would be a candidate to become prime minister, or at least he could be a prominent figure within the Socialist Party, a party that was almost dead until recently, or even that Hollande could become the next Speaker of the National Assembly.